You're listening to The Globalist, first broadcast on the 2nd of August 2024 on Monocle Radio. The Globalist, in association with UBS. Hello, this is The Globalist, broadcasting to you live from Midori House in London. I'm Georgina Godwin. On the show ahead...
Their brutal ordeal is over, and they're free.
Joe Biden announcing the release of US citizens held in Russia in the biggest East-West prisoner exchange since the Cold War. As we celebrate the freedom of Evan Gershkovich and others, there are many questions surrounding the deal. We'll take a look at the regional tensions in the Middle East and ask how far off we are from global contagion. As the UK introduces a new initiative to clamp down on violent disorder, we'll investigate how a local vigil was hijacked by far-right groups and examine what's driving their proliferation around the world. Then, Nina Dos Santos is here to have a flick through the papers. What have you found, Nina?
Well, Georgina, I'm particularly interested in a survey, a poll that the Times of London has conducted about how Kamala Harris is continuing to cement her lead in terms of support among women, but Trump, predictably enough, is cementing his lead among men. So the reason this is important is because in the next week to come, Kamala Harris will be picking her running mate, and it's likely that we're probably going to see a gender-balanced ticket here with her picking a male companion as potential VP.
It's Friday, so we'll be bringing you the regular slot from Andrew Muller, who reveals what he's learned this week, and we'll hand off a roundup of the big music stories. And finally, we head to Maison Alliance in the heart of the Olympic City to discuss what we can look forward to on Monocle in Paris. That's all ahead here on The Globalist, live from London. First, a look at what else is happening in the news. Brazil, Mexico and Colombia have called for Venezuela to release detailed voting tallies, while the United States says it considers the opposition candidate as the winner. A New York State appeals court has rejected Donald Trump's challenge to a gag order in his hush money criminal case, in which the former US president was convicted on charges stemming from payment to a porn star. And after what's been described as a massive overnight attack on the Russian-controlled city of Sevastopol in Crimea, authorities are evacuating a residential building that was hit by a missile fragment. Do stay tuned to Monocle throughout the day for more on those stories. Now, Evan Gershkovich, the American reporter for the Wall Street Journal, was freed yesterday after being held in Russia since March 2023. He's just one of the prisoners swapped between Russia and Western countries in the biggest exchange since the Cold War. At midnight, Washington time, a plane carrying Evan, Paul Whelan and Alsu Komasheva landed at Joint Base Andrews in Maryland to be greeted by the President and the Vice President.
This is just an extraordinary testament to the importance of having a president who understands the power of diplomacy and understands the strength that rests in understanding the significance of diplomacy and strengthening alliances. This is an incredible day.
That was Vice President Kamala Harris speaking as the hostages landed. And listening to that with me is Stephen Diel, who's a Russia analyst and Monocle Radio regular. Stephen, Harris was talking about diplomacy and alliance. Which countries were involved in these multilateral negotiations, and what do we know about how the swap came about?
The principal countries obviously are America and Russia, but Germany has played a significant role. Germany wanted some citizens back as well, or there's a large originally Russian population who live in Germany, and there's quite a few Russo-Germans who've been caught up in this. So, President Biden paid tribute to Olaf Scholz for his role in this. And then, of course, Turkey. Turkey, we think, has been working on this for a long time behind the scenes. That's where the exchange took place. One of the differences with Cold War exchanges. Of course, they tended to be in Berlin when it was divided between East and West. Now the exchange has taken place in Ankara, and I think that President Erdogan will do all he can to get as much credit as possible.
You're talking about Germany there, and of course key to Russia's demands was the release of Vadim Krasikov, who was being held in Germany. Tell us about that.
Well, this is where I have very mixed emotions about all this, and I am, as a former journalist who worked for many years in Russia and as someone who knows Vladimir Karamazov very well, I can't be totally detached from this story. But the role of Krasikov, this is not a fair swap. When I was asked yesterday, what do you think about this? I said, well, I have two cheers. I'm not saying three cheers for the fact this swap has taken place, because what you've got coming from Russia, you've got totally innocent people who've been imprisoned for their political views or things they've said truthfully about the war in Ukraine. You've got Krasikov, who is an assassin. We know he carried out one murder in Berlin. That's why he was in prison in Berlin. He murdered Zelimhan Hangashvili, a Chechen who the Russians objected to, and he shot him in cold blood in Berlin's Tiergarten in 2019. So he is a criminal. He's a murderer. It's believed that he's committed a murder back in Russia before now, for which he was let off. Putin wants these kind of people back. Putin met him at the airport when he flew back, which just shows what Putin's priorities are. So the fact that you have a murderer, you have hackers, you have people who've broken sanctions, you have criminals coming back to Russia, but you have totally innocent people coming out of Russia. That shows the priorities of both sides.
Tell us about Vladimir Karamazov, who I know is a friend of yours.
Vladimir, I've known for over 25 years now. He, as a young man, he was at a time of free press in Russia in the 1990s. He was here in England. He was studying. He also worked as a correspondent for the newspaper Kommersant. We got to know each other then, and we've stayed in touch off and on ever since. He now lives in Washington, and that's where he'll be going back to his wife and two children, which is just wonderful. But he is one of the loveliest people you could meet. He is very determined. He actually went back to Russia. He said to his wife and friends, I can't be a leader of the opposition when there's a war going on caused by my country. So in April 2022, he went back to Russia. And I've spoken about this with Zhenya, his wife, and she said, I love him and hate him all at the same time. I understand why he had to go back, but I wish he hadn't, obviously. And I think she possibly resigned herself to the fact she'd probably never see him again. He was sentenced to 25 years in prison for things he'd said in the West about the war. Totally truthful things he'd said about the war. And he was accused of treason. So in a way, I feel he might be almost slightly frustrated, although he's been very ill. He was poisoned twice when he was in the West by Putin, on Putin's orders. And recently he's been in prison hospital. So it'll be very interesting to see the condition of his health. But it's a huge relief for anyone who knows him and anyone who believes in freedom of speech, to be honest, that he's out.
Why do you think this exchange has happened now? Is the timing significant?
I think it might be. It comes also, people have been saying quite correctly that Putin has raised this issue back in February, actually shortly before Navalny was killed. He was talking about wanting Krasikov back and maybe there could be some deal done. And I think then, almost as a symbol perhaps of the death of Navalny, show, well, we're not letting him go because he was public enemy number one for Putin. But they've been talking about that. But it also comes at a time when Putin has been talking about a peace deal in Ukraine, putting forward totally unacceptable ideas for Ukraine, but he's been talking more about it. And there must be pressure on Putin to realise that what he started in Ukraine is never going to finish the way he wanted it to, i.e. Russia taking control of the whole of Ukraine. That's just not going to happen. So whether there are those around him who are saying, look, we can't just keep showing this vicious face to the West. We've got to try and show some sort of compassion. That's how it'll be presented. Look what we've done. Isn't it wonderful? We've allowed these people to leave. So there may be an element of seeking peace in Ukraine in this as well. So I think that has something to do with the timing.
What are the risks involved in a deal like this? Could it just encourage hostage-taking?
Unfortunately, that is a huge risk that could happen. But also, of course, you've got people like Krasikov, the murderer, going back. It is entirely possible not only that he will be asked to do dirty deals, what they call wet matters in the language of the KGB, of murders within Russia, because there are still people that object to Putin, object to the war. But I don't put it beyond them to give him a new identity, change his appearance a bit, and send him out on another mission abroad. So this doesn't draw a line under the killings. It doesn't draw a line under Russia's attempts to disrupt Western society, and it doesn't mean that Russians now are free to say what they want. There are still, it must be remembered also, there are still hundreds, probably about 700 political prisoners in Russia right now.
Stephen, finally, in an astonishing, audacious move, what did Evan Gershkovich write to Putin on his release?
I think this is wonderful. He was asked to write an appeal to Putin for clemency, and apparently, and his Russian, of course, has got very, very good, being 16 months in prison with some tough guys. So he wrote this full page saying, yes, Mr. President, I asked for clemency. And he ended up at the bottom to show that he hasn't lost his sense of humour and to show what a brilliant journalist he is. And by the way, could I have an interview with you when this is all over?
Fantastic. Stephen Deal, thank you very much indeed. This is The Globalist. It's 9:13 in Jerusalem and 7:13 here in London. Fears of an escalated conflict are growing in the Middle East. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has said his country is on a high state of alert. And this comes amid growing expectations that Iran or its allies will retaliate for the killing of senior leaders of Hezbollah and Hamas this week. Well, there have been many flashpoints in modern history when it was feared that the situation would escalate into an all-out global conflict. But as Roger Boys put it, writing in the Times yesterday, a third world war has always been avoided by looking away when hostile powers performed unacceptable acts. Well, I'm joined now by Paul Rogers, Open Democracy's international security expert, and Leila Malana Allen, Monocle's Middle East correspondent. Good morning to you both, and thanks for joining us. Leila, will there be any looking away this time? Despite Iran's previous reluctance to involve itself directly in the conflict, can the country ignore the assassination that took place in its capital city?
Iran is in a very difficult position now, and it's really interesting to see how both Iranian leaders and Israeli leaders have responded to these two assassinations. Now, of course, in the space of 24 hours, we saw two of the most important people in this conflict assassinated by Israel, but they were very different things. What happened in Beirut was a direct response to the shelling of Majd al-Shams in the occupied Golan Heights, which is currently occupied Israeli territory, and they, in retaliation, hit Beirut, the suburbs of Beirut, and they killed Fouad Shukr, who's a major Hezbollah commander, second in command. He's also been wanted by the Americans for years for having ordered the Marine barracks bombing in 1983 that killed 241 US servicemen. So the Americans are very happy about that. That's a direct response to what happened, and Netanyahu stood up and very proudly said, we have managed this. What happened with Ismail Haniyeh, the political leader of Hamas, is very different. That's something obviously Israel's been trying to do for years, but specifically been trying to do since the beginning of the Gaza war. Now, the way they've responded, Netanyahu did not announce that assassination when he announced Fouad Shukr's, which is fascinating because, of course, it's in many ways a much bigger coup for them. You know, it gives him huge points in terms of saying he's trying to eliminate Hamas. However, what we've heard from Israeli sources is that they planned this assassination months ago. They planted a bomb in Ismail Haniyeh's hotel room 2 months ago in the build-up to the new presidential inauguration for the new president, Mossad Pezeshkian, in Iran. So it wasn't timed necessarily to happen at this point until that was organized. Now, they are saying this was standard espionage. For years, Israel has gone in and assassinated people in Iran or Iranian leaders in other countries like Syria. Iran has responded saying that's not what happened. It was a surface-to-air missile that killed Ismail Haniyeh. These are hugely different things because Israel is saying this is our normal tit for tat. Iran is saying this is a declaration of war. Now, Iran is in a hugely difficult position because they don't want a war. Neither does Hezbollah. They're not in a position to fight one. But if they don't respond enough, it gives Israel free ground to do even more things like this on Iranian soil. So they'll be debating very carefully how they respond. It has to be bigger than the response to the attack on the Iranian consulate in Damascus, where they sent many rockets that they knew Israel and its allies would easily be able to intercept, and those did not hit anything.
Yeah. Now, Paul, just as the funerals of the slain Hezbollah and Hamas leaders were taking place yesterday, Israel announced that the airstrike in mid-July on a Gaza compound had succeeded in killing Mohammed Dief, the leader of Hamas' armed wing. What does it mean that Israel's willing to admit responsibility for that, and particularly at this point?
I think the basic thing is that you've got to see it from the point of view of Netanyahu. But Netanyahu's view is this war carries on. There is not going to be an early end. And he can point to these, what from his point of view will be 3 successes, and to say to the Israeli people, look, we are winning in terms of getting rid of the leadership. And I think this really means that we're in this for a long term. Any idea of a short-term ceasefire is basically for the birds. It simply isn't going to happen. And what this really means is that it doesn't matter quite so much who's going to win the American election, because there has been a change there. In many ways, Netanyahu was fairly happy about the way that the American election was going. Trump looked like he was going to win, but even if he didn't, and essentially Biden somehow got in, then because of his personal commitment to Israel, there wouldn't be too many problems. Kamala Harris is a different matter. And I think here you do have concern on the Israeli side that if she does get in, and that is possible, then that will be a change in attitude within the United States. At the same time, essentially, Netanyahu is so convinced that the war has to go on that even that may not sort of prevent him continuing, which means we're in this for the long term. And as was just said, this does involve the other states, most notably Iran. And I think the one thing that analysts are concerned about, although don't talk too much about it in public, is that at some stage Israel is going to have to decide that there will be attacks on Iran directly on its nuclear facilities. Because the one way, of course, that the Iranians could respond to what had happened recently is just to up the ante on the nuclear side. And their game there has been pretty clever. They got pretty close to developing weapons-grade uranium. They're probably within 3 to 5 months of actually being able to make a bomb if they choose to do so. They've not chosen to do so. If they were to take one small step more, then that would be basically the red line for the Israelis. I'm not sure the Iranians will do that, but there's a very big risk here.
Leila, Iran does still have a number of options. It has a new president, Masoud Pezeshkian, a so-called moderate who won the election by promising to improve ties with the outside world. What courses of action may he now be considering?
The first thing that it's really important to point out is Masoud Pezeshkian doesn't have that much power. In the end, it is the supreme leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, who makes these decisions, right? I mean, they even create the pool of people who are allowed to run to be the Iranian president. So now he is a moderate. He's a moderate in the scale of, what's acceptable in Iran under the regime. Originally, people thought he might not be allowed to run. He has now been allowed to run. That was much more a response to the protests that we saw in Iran last year. This is kind of standard authoritarian leadership handbook where at the time that protests are happening, you absolutely crack down, you say no way. But the reality is that the Iranian leadership doesn't want to be having protests all the time. So if they can slowly give a little bit of a carrot to people who want a little bit more liberalism, they're willing to do that. In terms of foreign policy, he is not going to be making the final decision. But what they will be debating right now is what level of volley do we send back? Do we send another group of rockets that we know are going to be immediately intercepted? Do we try and assassinate somebody? Do we instead hit areas, in the kind of borders of Israel? What are the ways that we can try and get involved? Because they won't want another retaliation. They'll also be being lent on by various groups, including Hezbollah, because one of the things that's really important here is that Iran doesn't want a war because it can't fight one right now. It's stretched on multiple fronts. Hezbollah doesn't want a war because it doesn't want people in Lebanon to die. Many people would argue, perhaps rightly, that Hamas leadership really doesn't care about the people who are living under its governorship in Gaza, right? Hezbollah is different. Hezbollah cares deeply about the people that live in South Lebanon. and the part of Beirut that it governs. It is a social and political organization within Lebanon. It's managed to build a lot of support there, and it runs social services. So they get incredibly angry when their citizens living in their areas are killed. That's why they said that Beirut, these suburbs, are a red line. So there will be discussions being had between all these proxy groups that Iran funds on how to retaliate in a way that doesn't mean many more people are killed, both in terms of civilians and in terms of top leadership. This has really put Hamas in a disastrous situation in terms of the fact that if Mohammed Deif, who's the military leader inside Gaza, has also been killed, really in terms of the top leadership, the only person that's left is Yahya Sinwar, who, as far as we're aware, is living in these tunnels underneath Gaza. So they've got to make a calculated decision on how much to show force and how much to decide to pull back and say, okay, Israel's really eliminating our ranks right now. Let's get together and remuster and figure out how we want to move forward in this wider conflict.
Yeah. And Paul, finally, given that Russia is close to Iran, close to North Korea and to China and to several African nations, mostly in the Sahel, and that it is the instigator of the war in Eastern Europe, how likely is it that we will see a conflagration of conflicts? Could this become a global fight?
I think that is pretty risky. It's always possible. But when push comes to shove, Russia does not want this. In fact, it does have concerns about its own problems of even crewing, of even personing the war in the Ukraine at present. There are quite clear signs there. There are pressures there. So Russia doesn't want this. But of course, you come back time and time again to the old thing of that acronym AIM, accidents, incidents, and mavericks. It's the things that are untoward and unexpected that can happen within a period of high tension. And the problem is that is apparent in multiple areas, the ones that you just listed. This is the danger, I think, that there's nothing wanted by intention. Essentially, neither Hezbollah nor Israel want a war between the two of them, but it could happen by accident. It could happen on the wider sphere. And this is why any attempt to sort of ease tensions in any part of this wider situation is welcome and I would say thoroughly necessary at present.
Paul Rogers and Leila Malala Allen, thank you both very much indeed. Now, still to come on the programme.
Building is the theme of today's Monocle in Paris. I'm Emma Nelson and I'll join the Globalist a little later to tell us more about how to create a major sporting venue and take it down again, how the Games set the foundations for a brighter Parisian future, plus a gold medalist will be in the studio to teach me how to throw a javelin.
Thank you very much, Emma Wills. Stay out of your way. This is The Globalist on Monocle Radio.
UBS has over 900 investment analysts from over 100 different countries.
Over 900 of the sharpest minds and freshest thinkers in the world of finance today.
To find out how we could help you,
contact us at ubs.com.
Let's continue now with today's newspapers, and joining me in the studio is Nina Dos Santos, who's an international broadcast correspondent and the former CNN Europe editor. Nina, when throwing ahead to this part of the programme, basically the Times is saying that US men would rather vote for Donald Trump than anybody who's female, is the gist of the story.
Yeah, so the Times of London have commissioned a poll by YouGov, the reputable polling agency. Remember that big UK newspapers like the Times and some of their competitors are investing hugely in events stateside ahead of this election, and that's one of the reasons why I'm picking this out as opposed to a US newspaper's polling, because what's really interesting about it is that they're saying, predictably enough, Kamala Harris is the favoured candidate by women, leading by about 11 points according to this poll, but Trump is still the favoured candidate by men and doing slightly better, enjoying an 18-point lead there as a result of this polling. What it shows is that obviously Kamala Harris, for her part, does, yes, better than Joe Biden among women, but she also does worse than Biden among men. And this is also perhaps concerning for the Democrats in the sense that it is Latino voters and also black male voters who have been abandoning the Democratic Party over the stance on Israel and the war with Hamas and Gaza, and also just a sense that the economic revival that the United States has been undergoing recently hasn't really extended to people who are blue-collar workers among that cohort.
Of course, we've seen all this before with Hillary Clinton in 2016.
Yeah, and what's really interesting about this particular poll, Georgina, is that it says the United States is now a lot more misogynistic than 2016. So it says that essentially Kamala Harris is going to have a much harder time getting elected, even if she's continuing on the Democratic baton, because obviously Joe Biden, the current president, is from her party. Usually incumbents have a better chance of keeping hold of the presidency. Obviously, that wasn't the case in the last election when Donald Trump lost to Joe Biden. But it says that things are looking worse for any woman running for office compared to 8 years ago. And that's really interesting because obviously Kamala Harris is the only second time that we've seen a US female presidential candidate. Each one of those times, those women are taking on Donald Trump, who is arguably one of the more misogynistic, let's say, candidates in terms of his policies and some of the things that he said about people like Kamala Harris and, of course, Hillary Clinton.
Let's go to Venice now, where European tourist hotspots are keeping a very close eye on Venice. They've become the first city in the world to introduce a payment system for visitors. That was an experiment aimed at dissuading day trippers from arriving during peak periods. But now they're actually putting in more measures.
Yeah, that's right. They're talking about fining groups over 25 people €500. So essentially the groups of these tourists are going to be smaller. They're not allowed to use loudspeakers. What they're trying to do here, obviously, is curtail the anger that many tourist hotspots are facing this summer against the phenomenon of overcrowding and over-tourism. And Venice has long had this problem because of the huge cruise ships that dock on the other side of the lagoon and then disgorge huge amounts of tourists who often just come for the day, don't spend money in the expensive hotels overnight, and sort of crowd the streets in these tour groups. Now, the tour groups on the other side say, well, look, this has been sprung upon us at the last minute. If you're going to have smaller groups of tourists who are very interested in the city, quite rightfully interested in learning about our history and architecture, you're going to have to issue more permits very, very quickly to more tour guides, and you haven't put these measures in place. I think what Venice is trying to do here is balance the local anger that we've seen in places like Barcelona. My own twin sister was just bemoaning to me, having come back from the beautiful confines of Avignon, the Luberon, that it's no longer what it was because of overcrowding as well. Even in, sort of bucolic settings like the south of France, wherever you are in the world, they're facing these villages and historical landmarks are facing huge swarms of tourists ever since the COVID-19 pandemic. Lots of them also coming from the United States, buoyed, as I was pointing out before, by that, US economy that's doing quite a bit better and the increased purchasing power of US tourists. But Venice was the first city actually to impose a pilot scheme for charging visitors €5 per person to actually visit the city. They're probably now going to actually reintroduce that pilot scheme and double that fee to €10, again, just to try and curtail these numbers of people.
Well, if you are looking for a cheap holiday, Japan is the place to go at the moment when you look at exchange rates. But we're looking now at a story out of Japan, which is very unfortunate.
Yeah, that's right. Well, the yen has been falling quite a bit recently, and what that means is that commodity prices are actually commodities are actually in more and more hot demand over there. Not least because obviously the renewable energy phenomenon around the world means that everybody's scrambling to get their hands on everything from raw earths to, for instance, copper. And this has had some devastating consequences. In Japan, about 90 miles north of Tokyo, we've learned today, according to one of the newspapers, that 1 million chickens died because 150 metres worth of copper wiring was overnight stripped out of a poultry factory. That meant that the air conditioning units shut down and all these chickens sadly lost their lives. And I suppose this speaks to a couple of phenomena. One, as I was saying before, metal burglaries have been rising everywhere in the world, including in the UK. But in Japan, this is quite unusual because crime is traditionally quite low. So the security procedures aren't always quite as stringent as they are in places like the UK. But I suppose people think that theft of metal and copper wiring is often a victimless crime. As we know now, it isn't. It's had this really awful effect where it's killed 1 million chickens in just a couple of hours, who essentially suffocated because somebody stripped out $30,000 worth of copper wiring from a factory.
Nina, before you go, it's summer. We're all putting our hats on, or at least I hope we are, or lashings of sun cream lotion anyway. But apparently the bucket hat has just got royal approval.
That's right, from Princess Anne, no less. 73 years old, famous for her great bouffant coiffures, and also famously well known for sporting a rather large hat, as many royals do. She's now been spotted wearing a $30 JD Sports, that's a high street sports retailer, bucket hat. And this means that apparently the royals are endorsing, one of the less elaborate parts of headwear, I suppose. It comes just, hot on the heels of Wimbledon, hot on the heels of the likes of Ascot and other social occasions, like the Henley Regatta, where people sport these huge hats. Suddenly she's gone down market a little bit and decided, look, it's time for bucket hat revival. And the Telegraph have spotted her at it, and heaven forbid, Georgina, she's also wearing Adidas sneakers too.
Do you have a headgear speciality?
I'm terrible with hats, actually. I don't know what it is. Maybe it's because I lived in Italy for many years and very few people actually wear them. No, I always forget a hat, unless it's really, really hot, and then I might wear a baseball cap. No bucket hats in my wardrobe, mind you. Be warned.
Nina de Santos, thanks very much indeed. Now, here's what else we're keeping an eye on today. Brazil, Mexico and Colombia called for Venezuela to release detailed voting tallies, while the United States said it considered the opposition candidate as the winner amid a dispute over presidential election results that sparked protests. More than 1,200 protesters have been arrested so far in what the government is calling an attempted coup by the opposition. A New York State appeals court has rejected Donald Trump's challenge to a gag order in his hush money criminal case, in which the former US president was convicted on charges stemming from payment to a porn star. This means the presidential nominee cannot comment publicly about individual prosecutors and others in the case until he's sentenced on September the 18th. That's just 7 weeks before the election. And after what's been described as a massive overnight attack on the Russian-controlled city of Sevastopol in Crimea, authorities are evacuating a 9-storey residential building that was hit by a missile fragment. Meanwhile, residents in areas of eastern Ukraine are fleeing after fresh Russian attacks there. This is The Globalist. Stay tuned. In Britain, the Prime Minister Keir Starmer announced yesterday that a new national capability across police forces will be set up to tackle violent disorder. This includes the wider deployment of facial recognition technology and criminal behaviour audits, he said. It follows the murder of 3 children on Monday, stabbed to death in Southport, just outside Liverpool, and the subsequent rioting by right-wing racist thugs responding to fake news that a Muslim migrant who was on the Security Service's watch list was responsible for the deaths of the children. Well, Alexander Clarkson is a lecturer for German and European Studies at King's College London and joins me now. Alexander, many thanks for coming on the show. I wondered if you could start by giving us a quick overview of how the reaction to this tragedy, perpetrated by a Welsh-born teenager, sparked unrest in several parts of the country.
Well, what effectively happened is that it was a rather disturbing indication of how it's very difficult to read what the trigger points are now for these forms of disorder. Several accounts, there's some speculation that they've been linked to Russia, so effectively made up a perpetrator and claimed it was a Muslim perpetrator linked to a watch list, that it was or had come on a boat as a refugee, and effectively managed to create a process through which these ideas were disseminated through various far-right social media sites, which then spread on to a kind of a wider audience, which still, if you actually look on social media, is still convinced that there is a conspiracy or a plot to cover this up. This was, of course, then piggybacked by figures like Nigel Farage, I wouldn't call him a colleague, Matthew Goodwin and others, who then sort of used this information to sort of help stoke an environment that provided a pretext for several attacks on Muslim communities, vulnerable Muslim communities. So these are groups in areas where there aren't large Muslim minorities, and then we saw the scenes that happened today. So it used to be a few years ago that if there was an attack involving an actual person of Muslim origin with a potential terrorist dynamic, that you had to look out for these risks. Now you have an environment in which these kinds of disinformation gets disseminated, where it's very, very difficult to read when and where this will happen, because you have an environment entirely structured around just generating entirely false news, and it makes it much, much more difficult for the authorities like the British police, the German or the French or the Belgian police, Italian police, to figure out when this is going to happen and where.
I wonder how and why the far right is growing in Britain, and how the UK fits into that bigger movement within Europe.
I think the term growing is problematic. There's always been, I think this is a matter of discussion between, people like me who work more in Europe and other colleagues, but the view from people from the European side was that there was always a far right in the UK. And there was always a substantial group of people willing to engage on this area. It's not been growing. It's not a substantial part of British society. I mean, you can argue about the percentages. Is it people from 5 to 10% of the population perhaps prone to this or not? But it's something you find in every European society. It's been partly sort of suffocated or kept aside because of the vagaries of the British political system, the first past the post system. That meant you had 2 or 3 dominant parties. But now with social media, with other kind of movement and organization ways, with other channels outside of Parliament, the strengthening of the Reform Party, because of the developments of the last couple of years in British politics, suddenly what was always there is now coming to the fore, has a more open media and political outlet that can gain wider attention, gain wider recruits. But is it rampantly expanding? I would argue not necessarily. It was always there. It was just more easily marginalized, ignored in previous British political cycles.
Just looking at the demographics of these groups, is it true to say that they're usually working class men? I mean, that seems to be the case in the US, where Trump's exploited the fact that demographic feels left behind by the Washington progressives.
But I think that's always been, that's always been also, I think, a problematic framing. There are people who fit those categories in substantial numbers that take part in these movements. But if you look at voting patterns in the UK, say towards the Brexit Party, and I think if Nigel Farage, for example, is diving into this debate in a certain way, it becomes more and more difficult not to claim that he represents a far right strand in British politics. So if you look at the kind of voting patterns, both towards the MAGA GOP of Donald Trump or the AfD, the Rassemblement National, they're actually much more socially diverse. You have a lot of people in middle class or upper middle class categories voting for their own reasons or embracing for their own reasons these kinds of narratives. You increasingly also have people from other immigrant groups who for a variety of different reasons, traditional hostility to Muslim communities and these diaspora communities, or a desire to over-assimilate, or an embrace, say, in the French context of a particular Republican ideal of France, that all also begin to see them playing a role in these kind of environments as well. So it's actually a much more socially and politically diverse group. The so-called white working class is what you visibly see on the surface, but there's much more going on below that surface.
And just quickly before we go, I mean, that the influx of migrants really seems to light the fire under these far-right groups, but migrants themselves are reacting to war, to climate change, to economic mismanagement, corruption in their own countries. Is it naive to expect that strengthening policing, as Britain is now suggesting we do, can fix this? What is the solution?
Well, I think of course, policing isn't the only solution. Of course, there's a whole set of issues to do with integration, also issues to do with basic issues with welfare and housing. Societies or parts of societies, say in France and the UK, where there's weak social welfare provision, where you end up generating a whole set of conflicts because the state doesn't live up to its welfare responsibilities, are also environments where this can happen. But the UK does have a weakness in policing. Countries like France has the CRS, the Gendarmerie, Germany has the Bundespolizei, Italy has the Carabinieri, Spain has the Guardia Civil. These are all national units structured around public order that are part militarized and actually quite tough and watch these things. So Britain actually has a weakness here. And Keir Starmer, with his background in law and order justice, is aware of how a French Gendarmerie or the Spanish Guardia Civil Italian Carabinieri works. So there is something here that has to be fixed. And it's not easy to fix. It's easy to announce this kind of thing, but to set up an organization or set up at least a kind of a broad coordinating structure to act more quickly and effectively, which they will have to now because these things are becoming more unpredictable, that takes time and money. And we'll have to see whether this government, as with any UK government, is willing to invest that time and money.
Alexander Clarkson, many thanks. This is Monocle Radio. Now it's Friday, which means we'll be hearing from Andrew Muller for his take of the weird and wonderful happenings of the last 7 days.
We learned this week that the 2024 Paris Olympic Games were not, by golly, going to let down those of us, and we grant that it's a niche audience, whose favourite Olympic event is not the pole vault, or the archery, or the ping pong, or even the sprint canoeing, but the raising of the wrong flag and the playing of the wrong anthem. In the first week of competition alone, we got both. Yes. Well, sort of. We learned during the opening ceremony of an amount of confusion apparently besetting the official announcers vis-à-vis which Korea is which.
Olympic organizers have issued a deep apology after South Korea's athletes were mistakenly introduced as North Korea at the opening ceremony. Both the French and English announcers introduced them as the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, the official name of North Korea.
Which, of course, brought back gladdening memories of the glorious moment at the 2012 London Games, at which North Korea's women's football team were welcomed, one would prefer to believe deliberately, with a South Korean flag, at which they threw a massive tantrum and refused to come out of their dressing room for an hour. Happy days. And we learned that Paris's Olympic organisers are, or now that they have been set right in no uncertain terms were, equally befuddled regarding which Sudan is which. Ahead of South Sudan's first match in the men's basketball tournament, the South Sudanese were fanfared with this. Which, as any idiot knows, is the national anthem of Sudan.
Oh, in 2020,
Really?
get on it.
Ridiculous.
Come
That's just
on.
math.
Is it amateur hour?
Indeed. Instead of this, which is South Sudan's actual anthem. And is, in fairness, not a bad tune, an assessment with which I believe the General Muttered Agreement crew will concur.
I think it's,
But we learned in general, and what with one thing and another, that for all the labours, straining and indeed exertions of the athletes competing at the Paris Olympics, nobody was working harder than those professionally preoccupied with apologising for the Paris Olympics. For we learned that in the United States, American conservatives, specifically those avowedly granite-jawed, rock-ribbed American conservatives, always first to sternly admonish that your hurt feelings are unimportant and that their free expression is sacrosanct, had abruptly reversed positions upon witnessing certain portions of Paris's intermittently risque opening ceremony. And we learned that as a consequence of having witnessed such depravity, nobody was now more concerned with hurt feelings and less interested in free expression than Congressman Ryan Zink, Republican representative of the Montana 1st District.
We're not comfortable with watching the Olympics. Disgusting display, dishonorable. We're not comfortable with the woke.
Except, perhaps inevitably, this guy.
I thought that the opening ceremony was a disgrace, actually. I thought it was a disgrace.
The mocking of the Last Supper.
I thought it was
Catholics and Christians across the globe are outraged.
I mean, they can do certain things. I thought it was terrible.
But we learned that guy is a potential future lock for Olympic gold in, and bear with us as we undertake a pivot of such grace and audacity that Simone Biles herself would be reduced to awestruck shivers.
Come on. Just get on with it.
In the admittedly unlikely event that freestyle marbles losing is ever admitted as an Olympic event. For we learned that Donald Trump's live appearance before the National Association of Black Journalists in Chicago went roughly as well as might have been predicted. We'll be needing that accordion backdrop again to evoke that weird thing he does with his hands while saying words with his mouth, as he did in this instance about his opponent, Vice President Kamala Harris.
She was always of Indian heritage, and she was only promoting Indian heritage. I didn't know she was black until a number of years ago when she happened to turn black, and now she wants to be known as black. So I don't know, is she Indian or is she black?
Tough, as they say, crowd. But we learned that Trump's running mate, as of this broadcast, Senator J.D. Vance, had identified a bold new attack line to take against the vice president.
Kamala Harris is a phony who caters to whatever audience is in front of her.
Which is fine talk from someone who has changed his name 4 times and became famous positioning himself as the voice of rural Kentucky while living in small-town Ohio, and who once described Donald Trump, for whom he is now abjectly stumping, as, quote, a morally reprehensible human being. But sticking with the subject of excruciating contortions and returning to the Olympics, and that right there is a brilliantly stuck landing. We learned that Italian gymnast and 2024 silver medalist Giorgia Villa has one of the more niche yet more charming sponsorship arrangements enjoyed by any athlete, specifically with cheese, even more specifically with a particular cheese distinctive to her country, wheels of which have featured frequently in her promotional photography, an arrangement for which she has doubtless been grateful.
Oh no.
Wait, there's more. It is, as of this broadcast, maddeningly unclear whether or not the arrangement is ongoing, prompting speculation that she has rethought the propriety of athletes taking the lucre of Big Palmer. And if you think you're getting an apology for that, you must be new here. For Monocle Radio, I'm Andrew Moore.
Thank you, Andrew. This is The Globalist.
UBS is a global financial services firm with over 150 years of heritage. Built on the unique dedication of our people, we bring fresh thinking and perspective to our work. We know that it takes a marriage of intelligence and heart to create lasting value for our clients. It's about having the right ideas, of course, but also about having one of the most accomplished systems and an unrivaled network of global experts. That's why at UBS, we pride ourselves on thinking smarter to make a real difference. Tune in to The Bulletin with UBS every week for the latest insights and opinions from UBS all around the world.
And it's time now to talk music with Will Hodgkinson, who is the Times rock and pop critic. Good morning to you, Will. I understand we catch you on your way to Munich.
I will be going there later on. This will be for the Adele concert, which is changing the way concerts are approached. She's not touring at all. She's playing in a specially built stadium in Munich in front of, I think, 80,000 people. 10 concerts over a 5-week run. Adele World. Apparently there's going to be a pub recreated like the one she used to drink in Kilburn, a massive stage, a giant screen, and the whole thing is based around one star. So it's an interesting approach, a new approach, really.
And is it one that you think will be adopted by others?
You've got to be really, really, really successful. I think Taylor Swift could do it. I don't know how many other people could do it, and we'll see if Adele can. I mean, it takes out touring. That's the appeal for the artist, but it means that everyone has got to go to them rather than them go to wherever, go to the countries. Mm. So it's asking a lot of audiences. Yeah, we'll see. I don't know. I'll tell you later.
Now, today is what would have been the 100th birthday of James Baldwin, the author, of course, of those wonderful masterpieces, The Fire Next Time, Go Tell It on the Mountain, Giovanni's Room, and so on. How has this been marked musically?
Michel Nigodicello, who is an American artist, is marking it with an album which is celebrating really his message. And it's a great album. It's got touches of jazz, Afrobeat, soul. And she's updating it. But, James Baldwin was a fascinating character because he was a civil rights activist, but he was primarily a writer and a poet, and he didn't want to be just defined by his blackness. He wanted to go beyond it. And that's kind of what Michel Nigodicello is trying to do. So she's talking about the Black Lives Matter movement, everything that's happened in the 100 years since his birth, but at the same time within his spirit. And it's a really beautiful album. I'd recommend people to go towards it.
And finally, we've got some business news, I suppose. It's the sale of Hypnosis. Tell us more about the end of mega payouts for song catalogues.
Well, this is significant because over the last 5 years or so, Hypnosis was buying up song catalogues for millions. The idea being that, once you own the catalogue of Neil Young or Bob Dylan or whoever it is, the money just keeps coming in. And what actually happened is then we had a period of inflation and the value, suddenly it couldn't earn out. So Hypnosis, which is seen as the great future, has actually been sold to Blackstone for about 1.1 billion, which sounds like a lot. But when you consider that just Bruce Springsteen's catalogue was sold to Sony for 500 million, it's not actually as much as it sounds. So it's I think it's the end of this period when music as a endless streaming sort of money-making service was overvalued.
Will, thank you very much indeed. Have fun in Munich at Adele. That's Will Hodgkinson there. And this is The Globalist on Monocle Radio. Finally on the show today, let's head to Paris to join the Monocle team there who are in place to bring you 2 weeks of live radio from the heart of the Olympic city. Well, Emma Nelson joins me now from Maison Alliance to tell us what will be on the show at the top of the hour. Emma, you've just reaching the end of week 1. How are you feeling?
It's a marathon, not a sprint, Georgina.
Yeah.
How are you? Paris is grey this morning, which is a change from the absolute wildness of the boiling heat and the downpour. But it's sort of brought a touch of gentleness to the scene because everything has been so intense for the last few days. At absolutely every single level. I mean, obviously the competitions are pretty intense to watch. It's pretty fun to try and get about town. The weather has helped and hindered in equal measure. Last night I was I'm in a roof, as obviously everybody in Paris is. I'm sleeping in a roof, and it was like being in a car wash when this storm came along. So we're sort of bedding in quite nicely today. But there's also that feeling that it's almost as if Paris has just sort of accepted its Olympics into its character now, that it's it'll be really strange when this finishes, put it that way, because all the bits of the city that you usually were able to walk through have been totally transformed into these amazing locations, and that's what we're going to be talking about today on Monocle in Paris. We've got we've got 2 amazing guests coming in. We've got Kevin Owens, who's founder of Woo Architects. They've worked on several venues across the games, and then we'll be hearing from an amazing man, Jeff Burke, who works for ES Global, which is a company which specialises in movable architecture. And what they have done is they've helped to design nigh on 60 temporary sites across the games. And to give you an idea of how much they're transforming this city, yesterday we all traipsed up to the Place de la Concorde, where there's this sort of exhibition area for the slightly edgier, cooler sports, such as BMX and skateboarding and basketball and stuff like that. And they'd placed it on, well, the last time I'd been on the Place de la Concorde, I was dodging cars. In fact, in absolutely no circumstances would anybody in possession of a brain even attempt to walk across the Place de la Concorde, let alone skateboard across it. And you had this phenomenal juxtaposition of looking at massive landmarks such as l'Assemblée Nationale and the Madeleine and the Tuileries Gardens, places which are sort of like symbolic and overwhelm the landscape, and they're just sort of being tucked away into a corner while I have these amazing structures which basically sort of have just taken over the place. So that's where we are now. We're sort of bedding in and trying to remember what the old Paris was like.
And in terms of these temporary structures, do they look temporary?
No, they don't. Well, it depends what you mean. Do they look temporary? Have they got sort of solid metal, brick walls? No, they don't. But do they look as if they were put up at the local fair? Absolutely not. I mean, these things stand up. They're building half pipes and they're building stadiums. There's a temporary swimming pool up at La Défense. I mean, the ability to build a temporary swimming pool in La Défense is amazing. So no, there is absolutely zero sense that this stuff could stick around. And sometimes you do get these events where I think the Eiffel Tower, let's not forget that was always intended to be a temporary structure, and they realised that it was so beautiful that it would be absolute madness to take it down. There's talk now that the beautiful cauldron, the balloon, which is tethered in the Tuileries Gardens at the moment and goes up and down at night to act as a sort of sun and moon for the Olympics. There are arguments now and there's persuasions now saying, please, can we have this as a permanent structure? So whether we see the sort of elements of the Olympics, traces becoming sort of meshed in within the more permanent structure of Paris is something that we'll see what happens. Because you'll also be looking at the longer legacy of creating the Olympics. Yes, we've got Mary Barsac, the Executive Director of Impact and Legacy for Paris 2024, and I'll be asking her about what happens when the Olympics leaves town. Because I think the average, and someone will have to correct me if I'm wrong, but the average sort of bounce after an Olympics is about 6 years in terms of sort of sports prowess. But it's always really important when you look at the kind of legacy that an Olympics will create for a city, because these games are really, really not cheap. They are billions. They cost billions and billions and billions. And when we're in the middle of a crisis when it comes to money, cost of living crisis, people have really got to get their money's worth. So I'll be asking Marie about what they do, where the priorities are, what are the hopes of sort of creating a more sporty Paris, where the welfare goes. Because also bear in mind, Georgina, we're going back to the temporary buildings thing. They're not building sort of legacy constructions like big stadiums and this, that and the other. What they're doing is they're improving what they have, and they're working. And I think the only thing that's been built is a big sports centre up at Saint-Denis, a big aquatic centre. These are things that the city needed, as opposed to the city would like to sort of sprinkle over itself. Absolutely. Emma, I have to go to make way for the next programme, which is in fact you. But I know that in the next show you are also going to introduce us to a gold medalist. We are. We're going to be meeting Thomas Röhler, who has just got the gold in javelin. And this is marvellous because it's the first time I think Germany has got a gold in javelin for 70 years. So we've asked him to bring in his medal. It's probably slightly more portable than his javelin. And if we got time, we might dig out a toothpick and try some technique. Emma Nelson, thank you very much indeed. And that's all for today's programme. Thanks to our producers Vincent McAvenny, Paige Reynolds and Monica Lillis, our researcher Sana Jumani, and our studio manager Christy O'Grady, with editing assistance from Jack Jewers. Monocle in Paris coming up. Emma will be learning to throw the javelin. I'll be back with you on The Briefing live at midday, and The Globalist returns at the same time on Monday. I'm Georgina Godwin. Thanks for listening.